What's going on, guys? This is Shivam Sharma here, and today I am going to discuss with you on the topic of popular full stack web frameworks. We will be covering full stack web frameworks like Rails, Django, Spring, ASP.NET, Laravel, and Next.js. For each of the framework, we will be looking at overall developer experience, including things like setup, routing, database integration, and overall architecture. But first, let's try to understand what a web framework actually does. First, they provide an object relational mapper or ORM that can migrate database operations from a preferred language to SQL queries. Second, they provide controller or an option for routing that can map a URL in a browser to the code you want to execute on the server. Thirdly, they provide a way to dynamically insert data from a database into the HTML. Together, these elements make up the MVC architecture or Model View Controller architecture, which is currently one of the most common approach used by web developers for building a web app. The first framework on our list is Ruby on Rails. Born in 2004, Ruby on Rails is written in Ruby and is famous for building some of the biggest companies in the world like GitHub, Airbnb, Shopify. It was quite revolutionary when it came out because it dramatically simplified web development compared to other approaches of the time, and it is still quite popular to the present day. To get started with Rails, first you need to have Ruby installed. Then install a gem, or in other words, a library called Rails. Then you need to run Rails new Rails app command. And if you're trying this on fresh install of Linux, then you'll likely run into some issues. Though through some googling and all you may resolve them, but initial setup is quite more error prone than others. Once the project is set up through Rails CLI, you will notice bunch of different folders here. And that's because Rails is a battery included framework, which means it handles your relational database, testing, logging, and a bunch of other stuff out of the box. Your main application code is contained in an app directory where you will find folders for models, views, and controllers. First, we will look at model. To use data in database, we need to run a migration, which will take code in the model and sync it up with the actual database, and all data is managed with an object relational mapper called ActiveRecord. Then we have a controller which is mapping URLs in browser and actions on controller actions. When user visits a URL, it will trigger one of the actions on server which will retrieve data from database. Then finally we have a view which is a html.erb file. ERB here stands for embedded Ruby, and it allows you to render your data dynamically inside your HTML file. Ruby is very opinionated because although you can achieve a lot of functionality with very little code, but too much magic is considered a bad thing by some software developers. Next up on our list is Next.js. Born in 2016, Next.js is used to build web apps for companies like Twitch, Hulu, and DoorDash. This framework allows you to build a full stack application entirely with JavaScript, and thus this is a part of JavaScript everywhere paradigm. To get started with Next, first you need to have Node.js installed, and then install npx using npm command. Then by running a create next app command, you will generate a starter project. One thing you will notice about Next right out of the bat is that it doesn't provide any integration for database, and that is because JavaScript ecosystem is way too big compared to other languages. So it's nice to start with very minimal framework and then add whatever database integration you want on top of it. Now if we open the pages directory, we will notice routing is handled with the file system. Each file defined in the pages directory defines a different URL in the browser. Dynamic routes can be created by wrapping the file name in brackets. Each one of these files exports a React component to define a view. This is actually very convenient because most of the other frameworks will like to have some kind of separate front-end framework like React, Vue, etc. after some time. So having React fundamentally integrated into the framework can streamline your productivity big time. In Next.js, you can run server-side code for data fetching in the view itself. The functions like get server-side props. Next.js will run this function on server with Node.js. As you can see in this code, we are using Prisma to fetch some items from the database. These items can be delivered as an argument to the React component where they are rendered in the UI. So basically in Next, your server-side code and the client-side code is tightly coupled. Next up on our list is Spring. Born on October 2002, Spring is used for building web apps by companies like Accenture, Intuit, and Udemy. Although Java is famous as boilerplate driven language, the Spring framework makes it quite enjoyable. Unlike other frameworks, Spring has a generator that allows you to start with the framework. You can choose all the different dependencies you want to add in this project. Once your project is set up, you will find source code in this deep way nested folder. Like other frameworks, Spring also follows the MVC pattern. Here controller is a class and route is defined using a decorator on each of its method. Spring relies a lot on meta programming to keep your code nice and simple. Spring can automatically create model for a database by loading SQL from schema.sql and data.sql files. Then we can use that data in templates using Timeleaf, where you can add attributes to your HTML to define where your data should go. Next up, we have Laravel. Released on June 2011, Laravel has been used by many companies like 9gag, BBC, and TourRadar. There have been countless web frameworks on PHP, but the most popular today is Laravel. To use it, you will first want to install PHP and a tool called Composer. As you can see, the initial project has lots of batteries included. If we look at routes folder, we can see not only it handles web routes, but also API routes and channels for real-time communications with WebSockets. If we look at the app folder, we will notice that it's already been configured with things like user authentication via providers. A provider is a shared service that you can use anywhere in the application. Our controllers lie in the HTTP directory. Here we will find our controllers, and just like Rails, we have a class that contains bunch of different methods that can access data and render a specific template. Our database models use a tool called Eloquent ORM, which is based on same active record pattern as Rails. When it comes to Vue, PHP is a language that's designed to work with HTML out of the box. Laravel makes it even easier by building on top of PHP with Blades template. Next up, we have .NET Framework, or also known as ASP.NET. First released on June of 2016, ASP.NET is an open source project maintained by Microsoft. It is extremely popular and reliable as it has evolved very nicely over time. It has modern supporting libraries like Blazor that allows you to build client-side apps using WebAssembly and C#. It is used by many big corporations like Stack Overflow, Microsoft, /. To use it, install the .NET SDK and generate a new MVC application. The initial project structure is pretty clean. Everything is clearly named and it's not too overwhelming. You get all awesome tooling and static typing like you get in Java. For routing, the URLs are inferred from the class names and your controllers. Here we have an animals controller which gives us the animals URL. Then we have a method in that class that represents the next URL segment. The method can take an argument to create a dynamic URL to present our data. To represent our data, we have a model that is managed by an ORM called the Entity Core Framework. The views in .NET are written in CS/HTML. At top of these files, you will notice a model where from we can access our data. Lastly, we have Django. It was first released in 2005 and has been quite popular since beginning. It has been used to build massive sites like Spotify, Bitbucket, and YouTube. To get started, you need to install Django first and then run start project command. When you generate the project, you will notice that file structure is far less overwhelming compared to other frameworks, but at the same time, it's still a very much batteries included framework. It also follows MVC structure with routes being defined in url.py file. We have our HTML templates in a templates folder that allows you to embed Python directly into your code. And the controllers are represented as Python functions in view.py file. A route points to one of these functions which itself might want to access data from one of our models. A model is a Python class that represents the structure of data in a SQL database or object relational mapper. Now I want you to pause this video and think if one framework is better than other in all use cases. Yes, you guessed it right. Each framework has its own pros and cons, and one needs to choose the framework which best suits the long-term needs. For example, Django is secure and scalable, but it's not as fast as Next. On the other hand, Next is not so famous for IO-intensive tasks. My main takeaway from understanding different frameworks would be that although we tried comparing different frameworks, you must have noticed how similar they are. if you can understand the MVC model, then you can pretty much figure out what's happening in any of these frameworks.